The Librarian's Secret Wish. Chapter 1. The Quiet Within the Stacks. Miss Penelope Ward had long ago perfected the art of being invisible. It was a skill she had cultivated with the same precision she used to dust the leather spines of first editions or to reshelve a misplaced volume of poetry. In the great library of Thornwell House, where shadows pooled in the corners and the only sounds were the whisper of turning pages and the soft chime of the clock on the mantel, invisibility was not merely a talent, it was survival. Thornwell House was not a public library, though to hear Penelope tell it, it might as well have been a cathedral. It was the private collection of the late Viscount Ashworth, a sprawling manor in the heart of the English countryside, and its library was considered one of the finest in the county. Shelves rose to the ceiling, laced with ladders on brass rails. Stained glass windows cast patches of jewelled light onto the worn Persian rugs. And in the centre of it all, behind a modest oak desk, sat Penelope, her hair the colour of weak tea pulled into a stern bun, her spectacles perched on the bridge of a nose that had been broken once, long ago, and never quite healed straight. She was 32 years old, though she looked older. Worry had a way of etching lines where laughter might have been. Her dresses were serviceable, grey or brown, high-collared and long-sleeved, as if she were perpetually in mourning for a life she had never been allowed to live. The villagers in the nearby town of Merrowdown knew her only as the Librarian, a ghost who walked from her small cottage to the manor each morning and back each evening, never deviating, never stopping for idle chatter. What they did not know, what no one knew, was that Miss Penelope Ward was a fraud. Not in the matters of books, of course. On that front, her knowledge was unimpeachable. She could recite the publication date of every volume in the library, name the binder who had tooled the leather on a 1743 folio, and identify a forged signature from 10 paces. But her name, her past, her very presence in Thornwell House, all of it was built upon a foundation of lies so fragile that she woke each night in a cold sweat, certain that the knock on her door had finally come. Her true name was Penelope Ashworth, and she was the late Viscount's disowned daughter. The story, as she had been forced to learn it, was simple and cruel. At 17, she had fallen in love with a groom, a handsome, reckless young man named Thomas Ward. Her father, the Viscount, had been apoplectic. Not because Thomas was poor, but because he was married. Penelope had not known. Thomas had not told her. When the truth emerged in a tangle of screams and flying crockery, Penelope had been cast out, her name erased from the family Bible, her existence denied. She had taken Thomas's surname as a penance and fled to London, where she had worked in a succession of dismal circulating libraries, slowly rebuilding herself into someone else. Her father had died 5 years ago. She had not attended the funeral. She had not inherited a shilling. But when the new Viscount, a distant cousin she had never met, had advertised for a librarian to manage the Thornwell collection, she had applied under her assumed name, desperate and daring. The interview had been conducted by post. No one had recognized her, and so she had returned to the only home she had ever known, not as a daughter, but as a servant. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years of walking past the portrait of her father in the great hall without meeting his painted eyes. 3 years of sleeping in the cottage her mother had once used as a summer dairy. 3 years of pretending that the library's gentle rhythms were enough to quiet the ache in her chest. Most days, she almost believed it. But on this particular October afternoon, as the wind rattled the leaded glass and sent dead leaves skittering across the gravel drive, Penelope felt the familiar prickle of unease. The library was empty. It was always empty, save for herself, but the air felt different, charged, as if the books themselves were holding their breath. She was cataloguing a recent acquisition, a tatty copy of Paradise Lost that had turned up in a trunk of old linens, when she heard it, the crunch of boots on the path outside. Not the soft tread of the housekeeper or the heavy step of the gardener. These were the boots of a stranger, purposeful and unhurried. Penelope set down her pen and straightened her spectacles. Visitors to Thornwell House were rare. The current Viscount, Lord Ashworth, lived abroad, in Italy, she had heard, or perhaps Greece. He had never set foot in the manor during her tenure. A steward managed the estate, a skeleton staff kept the dust at bay, and Penelope kept the books. The knock on the library door was firm but polite. Before she could rise from her chair, the door swung open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, with the lean build of a rider and the square shoulders of a soldier. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples, and his eyes were the colour of storm clouds, grey and restless. He wore a well-tailored travelling coat of navy wool, and his boots, she noted with a librarian's eye for detail, were bespoke, the leather supple and expensively worn. He was handsome in a way that suggested he had never needed to be told so, and for a moment Penelope forgot to breathe. "Miss Ward?" he asked. His voice was deep, with a rasp at the edges, as if he had recently been shouting across a windy moor. Penelope stood. Her knees felt unaccountably weak. "I am she. And you are—" He removed his leather gloves, tucking them into his pocket with a gesture that was almost unconscious. "Lord Christopher Dane." The name meant nothing to her. She waited. "I am the new Viscount Ashworth," he said, and the world tilted slightly on its axis. "My cousin died last month in a riding accident. I've inherited the title, the estate, and, I am told, a library that is the envy of the county." Penelope's mind raced. The cousin, the distant cousin who had hired her, was dead, and this man, this stranger with the storm-grey eyes, was now her employer. She forced herself to curtsy, the movement rusty from disuse. "My lord, I am so sorry for your loss. I did not know." "Neither did I, until the solicitor's letter arrived." He stepped further into the room, his gaze sweeping over the shelves with an expression she could not read. "I never met the man. We were not close. But I find myself unexpectedly in possession of a great many books, and I am told that you are the keeper of them." "I am the librarian, yes." Penelope clasped her hands in front of her to hide their trembling. "I have been here for 3 years. Your predecessor, the late Viscount, hired me by post. I hope my work has been satisfactory." Lord Christopher turned to face her fully, and for the first time his eyes lingered on her face. She felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch, assessing, curious, not unkind. "The steward speaks highly of you. He says the library has never been better organised." "That is kind of him to say. Kindness has nothing to do with it." He moved toward the nearest shelf, trailing his fingers along the spines. "I am a man who values truth, Miss Ward. I have little patience for flattery or obfuscation. If you have done well, I will say so. If you have failed, I will say that too." Penelope swallowed. "I understand, my lord." "Good." He pulled a volume at random, a history of the Crusades, and flipped it open. "I am not a scholar, but I am a reader. My father was a naval man, and he believed that a gentleman's library should be consulted, not displayed. I intend to make use of these books. I hope that will not inconvenience you." "Not at all," she said, and meant it. The thought of someone actually reading the volumes she had so carefully preserved sent a small thrill through her. "The library is here to be used. That is its purpose." He looked up at that, a flicker of something like surprise crossing his features. "Most librarians I have encountered are possessive of their collections. They treat books as artifacts rather than living things." "Books are both," Penelope said, and then immediately wished she had held her tongue. It was not her place to lecture an aristocrat on the nature of literature. But Lord Christopher did not seem offended. If anything, his eyes warmed by a fraction. "A fair point. I shall endeavour to treat them with the respect they are due." He closed the history and returned it to the shelf with care. "I will be staying at Thornwell for the foreseeable future. My London house is being renovated, and I find the country air agreeable. I trust that does not pose a problem." "Of course not, my lord. This is your home." "Is it?" He looked around the library, at the stained glass windows, the worn rugs, the portrait of her father's father hanging above the fireplace, and his expression grew distant. "It feels like a museum, or a mausoleum. I'm not sure which." Penelope said nothing. She knew exactly which. He dismissed her shortly thereafter, with a gruff instruction to continue her work and a promise that he would not interfere. She watched him go, his boots echoing on the marble floor of the great hall, and then she sank back into her chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lord Christopher Dane, the new Viscount Ashworth. He was not the cousin she had deceived. He was a stranger, with no knowledge of the family history. That was both a relief and a new kind of terror. He had no reason to suspect her true identity, but he also had no loyalty to the lie that protected her. If he grew curious, if he began to ask questions, the entire edifice of her life could come crashing down. She looked down at the copy of Paradise Lost on her desk, still open to the first page. "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," she murmured, and the words tasted like ash. Chapter 2. The Curious Aristocrat. Lord Christopher Dane had not intended to stay at Thornwell House for more than a fortnight. The inheritance had been a shock, the title an inconvenience, and the manor itself a draughty relic of a family he had never known. He was a man of action by nature. He had served in the cavalry in India, travelled the spice routes of the Orient, and climbed mountains in the Alps that had no names on English maps. The prospect of rusticating in the English countryside, surrounded by the ghosts of dead aristocrats, held little appeal. But the library changed everything. Not the library itself, though it was undeniably magnificent. What changed things was the librarian. Christopher was not a man given to whimsy or romantic fancy. At 38, he had long ago accepted that love was a commodity best traded in practical arrangements. He had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman of suitable breeding and fortune. She had broken it off when he returned from India with a scar across his ribs and a tendency to wake screaming from nightmares he refused to describe. Since then, he had kept his distance from matters of the heart, finding solace instead in the clean lines of a well-written history or the bracing logic of a philosophical treatise. He had not expected to find Miss Penelope Ward. In the first week of his residence, he observed her from a distance. She was punctual to the point of absurdity, arriving at the library each morning at precisely 8 o'clock and leaving each evening at 6. She took her luncheon alone, a small packet of bread and cheese consumed at her desk while she read. She spoke only when spoken to, and her answers were measured, careful, as if each word had been weighed on a scale before being released. She was, by any objective measure, plain. Her face was too thin, her nose crooked, her hair an indeterminate brown that she pulled back with such severity that it seemed to be trying to escape. Her hands were ink-stained, her fingernails bitten to the quick. She wore the same grey dress 3 days a week and a slightly darker grey dress the other 4. And yet, Christopher could not stop watching her. It was the way she touched the books, not like a servant handling fragile goods, but like a lover caressing a sleeping partner, tender, reverent, almost painfully intimate. When she read, her lips moved silently, forming the words as if they were prayers. When she catalogued, her brow furrowed in concentration, and she would sometimes hum, a soft, tuneless melody that he could hear only when the library was perfectly still. He found himself inventing reasons to visit the library, a question about a particular volume, a request for a recommendation on military history, an excuse to borrow a map of the local parish, which he did not actually need. Each time, she answered his queries with patient precision. Her grey eyes, he had noticed they were grey, the same shade as his own, never quite meeting his. On the 10th day, he decided to test her. "Miss Ward," he said, settling into the leather chair across from her desk, I have been meaning to ask you something. She looked up from her catalogue, her pen poised. Yes, my lord. How did you come to be a librarian? It was a simple question, innocuous on its face. But he saw something flicker across her expression, fear, perhaps, or grief, before it was smoothed away. I have always loved books, she said carefully. It seemed a natural profession. Most women of your class become governesses or companions to elderly aunts. Librarianship is unusual. Her chin lifted a fraction. I am not most women, my lord. No, he agreed, and let the word hang in the air between them. You are not. That is precisely why I am curious. She set down her pen with deliberate calm. Curiosity is an admirable trait in a scholar, my lord, but it can be a vice in a gentleman. There is little to tell. I worked in circulating libraries in London for many years. When the position at Thornwell became available, I applied. I was fortunate enough to be hired. Fortunate, he repeated, or perhaps overqualified. Her cheeks flushed, the first colour he had seen in them. I do not know what you mean. I have been reading some of your cataloguing notes, he said, leaning back in his chair. The annotations you add to the records, the provenance of certain volumes, the notes on binding, the cross-references to other editions. That is not the work of a woman who merely loves books. That is the work of a scholar, perhaps even a trained one. The flush deepened. I have taught myself, my lord. Necessity is a harsh but effective tutor. Is it? He tilted his head, studying her. She would not meet his eyes, and that, more than anything, told him she was hiding something. And where did you grow up, Miss Ward? Your accent is not London. It has a rural cadence to it. Somewhere in this county, perhaps. For a moment, just a fraction of a second, he saw panic in her face. Then she blinked, and it was gone. I was raised in the north, my lord. My family moved frequently. My father was a commercial traveller. We never stayed in one place for long. It was a lie. He was certain of it. But he did not press further. He had learned, in his years of travel, that secrets were like wild animals. They bolted if you approached too quickly. Better to wait, to observe, to let them come to you. I see, he said, and rose from the chair. Well, I shall not keep you from your work, but I wonder if you might do me a favour. Of course, my lord. I have a particular interest in the poetry of John Donne. I am told there is a first edition of his songs and sonnets somewhere in this collection. Would you be so kind as to locate it for me? Her eyes widened just slightly. The 1633 edition. Yes, I know where it is. I will bring it to you this evening. Thank you, Miss Ward. He paused at the door. And please, call me Christopher. We are to be neighbours, after all. My lord grows tedious after the 100th repetition. She did not answer, but as he walked away, he could have sworn he heard her whisper his name to herself, soft as a prayer. That evening, Penelope did something she had not done in years. She wept. Not loudly, not with the racking sobs of a woman undone. Just a slow, silent leakage of tears that dripped onto the leather cover of the Donne first edition as she carried it through the darkened manor. She had lied to him. She had looked into those storm-grey eyes and lied, and the weight of it sat on her chest like a stone. He was too perceptive, too curious. He had already begun to unravel the threads of her story, and if he pulled much harder, the whole tapestry would come apart. She imagined the look on his face when he learned the truth, that the quiet librarian was a disowned daughter, a disgraced woman who had returned to her father's house under false pretenses. Would he be disgusted? Angry? Would he have her arrested for fraud? She reached the door of the study, where he had taken to reading in the evenings, and knocked softly. Come in. He was seated by the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. his coat discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. In the flickering firelight, he looked younger, less the aristocratic lord, and more the soldier she suspected he had once been. He rose when she entered, a gesture of courtesy that seemed instinctive rather than performative. "You found it," he said, his eyes lighting on the volume in her hands. "The 1633 edition," she confirmed, holding it out to him. "It is in remarkable condition. The previous Viscount, your cousin, had little interest in poetry, but his father was a collector of some discernment." Christopher took the book from her, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The touch was brief, accidental, but Penelope felt it like a spark. She stepped back quickly, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were cold. He opened the volume with care, turning the fragile pages with the reverence of a man who understood what he held. "Listen to this," he said, and began to read aloud. "Busy old fool, unruly son, why dost thou thus through windows and through curtains call on us? Must to thy motions lovers' seasons run?" His voice was low, resonant, filling the small study with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Penelope stood frozen, her heart pounding. She had read Donne 100 times, had memorized entire stanzas in the lonely nights of her cottage, but she had never heard him like this, spoken aloud by a voice that seemed to understand every ache and longing in the lines. "He wrote that to his wife," Christopher said, closing the book gently. "Donne. He loved her with a ferocity that scandalized his contemporaries. They thought he was too passionate, too possessive, too much." "And what do you think?" Penelope asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her then, really looked, and she felt herself laid bare beneath his gaze. "I think," he said slowly, "that love is rare enough without apologizing for its intensity. I think that a man who loves fiercely is not to be pitied, but envied." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Penelope knew she should leave, should curtsy, murmur good night, and retreat to the safety of her cottage. But her feet would not move. She stood there, trembling, as Christopher set the book aside and took a step toward her. "Miss Ward," he said, "I have not been entirely honest with you." Her blood turned to ice. "My lord?" "I did not come to Thornwell merely to escape my London renovations. I came because I was running from something." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of frustration that made him look almost boyish. "I am a coward, you see. I have spent my entire life running from war, from grief, from the possibility of being hurt. I told myself I was adventurous, but the truth is simpler and uglier. I am afraid." Penelope stared at him, her mind reeling. This was not what she had expected. He was confessing, not accusing. "Afraid of what?" she asked. "Of staying still long enough to care about something I might lose." He met her eyes, and in his, she saw a vulnerability that matched her own. "I have been watching you, Miss Ward. I have been watching you for 10 days, and I have come to realize that you are the bravest person I have ever met." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "You are mistaken. I am a coward of the highest order." "No," he said firmly. "You are a woman who has built a life from nothing. You have created yourself day by day in the face of whatever darkness drove you here. That is not cowardice. That is courage beyond anything I have ever known." Her eyes filled with tears. She blinked them back furiously, angry at herself for being so transparent. "You do not know what you are saying. You do not know me." "Then let me," he said, and stepped closer still. "Let me know you. Not as your employer, not as a lord condescending to a servant, but as a man who has been alone for too long and has found, in the quietest corner of a dusty library, something he did not know he was looking for." Penelope's heart was a wild thing in her chest, beating against her ribs like a caged bird. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee this impossible moment before it destroyed her. But Christopher was standing so close that she could smell the brandy on his breath, the wool of his shirt, the faint trace of wood smoke in his hair. And she wanted, with a desperation that frightened her, to stay. "I cannot," she whispered. "There are things about me, things that would change the way you look at me." "Then tell me," he said. "Whatever it is, tell me." She closed her eyes. The truth sat on her tongue, heavy and sharp-edged, but before she could speak, a crash echoed from somewhere deeper in the house, the sound of a door slamming or a window breaking. Christopher turned, his body shifting into a soldier's ready stance, and Penelope, seizing the reprieve, fled. She ran through the darkened corridors, past the portrait of her father, past the great hall, out into the cold October night. The wind tore at her hair, pulling strands loose from her bun, and the gravel of the drive bit into her thin shoes. She did not stop until she reached her cottage, locked the door behind her, and slid to the floor with her back against the wood. "Fool," she whispered to herself, "fool, fool, fool." But even as she said it, she knew she would not run forever. The truth was coming, and when it did, it would either save her or destroy her. There was no middle ground. Chapter 3. Secrets emerge. The days that followed were a careful dance of avoidance and longing. Penelope threw herself into her work with a fervour that bordered on mania, cataloguing, cleaning and rearranging shelves that had already been catalogued, cleaned and rearranged a dozen times before. She arrived earlier and left later, timing her movements to avoid crossing paths with Lord Christopher. When she heard his boots in the corridor, she ducked into the stacks. When he called her name, she pretended not to hear. It was unsustainable, and she knew it. On the third day, he cornered her in the rare book room, a small windowless chamber at the back of the library where the most valuable volumes were kept under lock and key. She had been inspecting a 15th century book of hours, her loupe pressed to her eye, when the door opened and closed behind her. She did not need to turn around. She could feel him, like a change in the atmospheric pressure before a storm. "You have been avoiding me," he said. Not an accusation, a statement of fact. Penelope lowered the loupe and set down the book with exaggerated care. "I have been busy, my lord." "Christopher." "My lord," she repeated, and the word felt like a wall between them. He sighed and moved to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Miss Ward, Penelope. May I call you Penelope?" "You may call me whatever you like," she said quietly. "It will not change what I am." "And what is that?" She turned to face him then, her back against the shelves, her hands clenched at her sides. The rare book room was lit by a single gas lamp, and its flickering light carved hollows in his cheeks, deepened the shadows under his eyes. He looked tired, she realized, tired and sad and hopeful in a way that made her chest ache. "My name is not Penelope Ward," she said. He did not flinch, did not react at all, except to nod slowly, as if he had been expecting this. "I know." "You cannot know. You have only been here a fortnight." "I have been here long enough to read the parish records," he said, long enough to notice that the former Viscount had a daughter who disappeared 20 years ago, long enough to compare her description. Age, colouring, the mention of a nose broken in a childhood fall, with the woman who sits in my library every day, hiding behind spectacles and a grey dress. Penelope's breath caught. "You looked me up." "I am a curious man. I told you that." He stepped closer, and she pressed herself against the shelves, but there was nowhere left to retreat. "I also told you that I value truth. So let us have it, Penelope. All of it. Tell me why the daughter of this house is working as its servant." The tears came then, hot and shameful, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times, the exposure, the humiliation, the cold disgust in someone's eyes. But Christopher's eyes held none of that. They held only patience and a sorrow that seemed to mirror her own. So she told him. The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other like water breaking through a dam. Thomas Ward, the handsome groom, the secret meetings in the hayloft, the discovery of his marriage, not to her, but to a woman in the village, a woman with 3 children and a bitter, knowing smile, her father's rage, her mother's silent tears, the door of Thornwell House closing behind her, forever. I was 17, she whispered. I was a child, and I have spent the last 15 years paying for a crime I did not know I was committing. Christopher said nothing for a long moment. Then he reached out and, with a gentleness that undid her completely, brushed a tear from her cheek with the pad of his thumb. You were not the one at fault, he said. The groom deceived you. Your father abandoned you, but you have done nothing wrong. I lied to you, she said. I lied to everyone. I took a position under false pretenses. I am living in a cottage that belongs to this estate, eating food I have not paid for, breathing air that is not mine. The cottage was empty. The food is grown on land that has more than enough. And the air, he said, with the ghost of a smile, belongs to no one. He took her hands in his. They were cold, and he wrapped them in his warmth. Penelope, listen to me. I do not care about your father's cruelty or the groom's betrayal. I do not care that you used a false name to find work. What I care about is the woman standing before me, the woman who has tended these books with more love than their owners ever showed, who reads Dawn as if the words were written for her alone, who is brave enough to tell the truth even when it terrifies her. I am not brave, she said, but the protest was weak. You are, he insisted, and I am asking you, not as your employer, not as a lord, but as a man who has fallen hopelessly in love with a librarian, to stay, not as a servant, as yourself, as Penelope, whatever name you choose. She stared at him, her mind a blank white space where thought should have been. You cannot love me. You have known me for less than 3 weeks. I have known you for 3 weeks, he agreed, and I have been looking for you for 38 years. He lifted one of her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender that she felt something crack open inside her chest. Stay, he said again. Please. And Penelope, the disowned daughter, the invisible librarian, the woman who had spent 15 years running from herself, Penelope did the bravest thing she had ever done. She stayed. Chapter 4. Truth strengthens their bond. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Penelope's life and also the most terrifying. Christopher kept his word. He did not treat her as a servant, nor as a charity case, nor as a woman to be pitied. He treated her as an equal, as a partner in the long, slow work of restoring Thornwell House to something like a home. They spent their days together in the library, reading side by side, arguing over the merits of various poets, laughing at the absurdities of the ancient texts. He taught her to ride, and she taught him to identify the different species of moths that gathered around the library windows at dusk. In the evenings they sat by the fire in his study, and she told him the rest of her story. The lonely years in London, the boarding houses with their thin walls and thinner gruel, the moment she had seen the advertisement for the Thornwell position and recognised her one chance to come home. He listened without judgment, his hand wrapped around hers, and when she finished he simply said, You are remarkable. I am ordinary, she corrected. You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever met, he said, and kissed her forehead, and she believed him. But the truth, once spoken, could not be unspoken. And Penelope knew that it was only a matter of time before someone else discovered it. The threat came, as threats often do, from an unexpected quarter. Mrs. Harlow, the housekeeper, had served the Ashworth family for 40 years. She had known Penelope as a child, had pinched her cheeks and scolded her for tracking mud into the great hall. And though Penelope had aged, Though she wore spectacles and grey dresses and spoke with a carefully cultivated neutrality, Mrs. Harlowe's eyes were sharp. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the housekeeper appeared in the library doorway, her face pinched and pale. "My lord," she said, addressing Christopher with a curtsy that was more accusation than deference. "I must speak with you, privately." Christopher glanced at Penelope, then back at the housekeeper. "Anything you wish to say can be said in Miss Ward's presence." Mrs. Harlowe's lips tightened. "With respect, my lord, it cannot. It concerns Miss Ward." Penelope's heart dropped into her stomach. She rose from her chair, her legs unsteady. "It is all right," she said to Christopher. "I know what she is going to say." "Then you know it is true." Mrs. Harlowe's voice was sharp with outrage. "You are Penelope Ashworth, the Viscount's disowned daughter." The silence that followed was absolute. Christopher stood, moving to Penelope's side with a calm that belied the tension in his jaw. "Mrs. Harlowe," he said, "I am aware of Miss Ward's identity. She disclosed it to me herself weeks ago." The housekeeper's mouth fell open. "And you did nothing? She has been living here under false pretenses. She is a fraud, my lord, a liar who has stolen a position that should have gone to an honest woman." "She is neither a fraud nor a liar," Christopher said, his voice low and dangerous. "She is the daughter of this house, cast out as a child for a crime she did not commit. She returned not to claim an inheritance, but to care for the books her family left behind. If that is dishonesty, then I am a poorer judge of character than I believed." Mrs. Harlowe drew herself up. "The village will talk. The other servants will talk. You cannot keep her here, my lord, not without scandal." "Then let them talk," Christopher said. "I have faced down cavalry charges in India. I'm not afraid of a few wagging tongues." But Penelope saw the truth in his eyes. He was afraid. Not for himself, but for her. Scandal would cling to her like burrs to a woolen skirt. She would be whispered about in every shop in Merrowdown, pointed at in the church, shunned by the few acquaintances she had made. And Christopher, for all his good intentions, could not protect her from that. "Perhaps I should leave," she said quietly. "I have done it before. I can do it again." Christopher turned to her, his expression fierce. "No." "My lord." "No," he repeated. "You are not running again, Penelope. Not from this. We will face it together, or not at all." Mrs. Harlowe looked between them, her outrage faltering into something like confusion. "My lord, you cannot mean to. She is not your equal. She is—" "She is the woman I intend to marry," Christopher said. The words hung in the air, shimmering like heat haze over a summer road. Penelope forgot to breathe. Mrs. Harlowe forgot to curtsy. Even the dust motes in the sunbeams seemed to pause in their lazy dance. "You cannot," Penelope whispered. "I can," he said, and took both her hands in his. "I am the Viscount Ashworth. I can marry whomever I choose. And I choose you, Penelope. I chose you the moment I walked into this library and saw you sitting behind that desk, surrounded by books that loved you as much as you loved them. But the scandal is nothing compared to the thought of spending the rest of my life without you." He dropped to one knee, there on the worn Persian rug, with the housekeeper staring and the afternoon light slanting through the stained glass windows. "I know we have not known each other long. I know the world will say we are being reckless, foolish, indecent. I do not care. I love you. I love your quiet strength, your fierce intelligence, the way you hum when you think no one is listening. I love that you survived when everything and everyone told you to give up. And I am asking you, not as a lord, not as a man in need of an heir, but as Christopher, who has been alone for far too long. Will you marry me?" Penelope's vision blurred with tears. She looked down at this man, this impossible, wonderful, stubborn man, and saw in his face not the condescension of an aristocrat, but the open, vulnerable hope of someone who had finally found a home. "Yes," she said. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." He rose and kissed her, there in the rare bookroom, with the smell of old leather and dust and something like forever all around them. And when they finally parted, Mrs. Harlow was gone, retreated perhaps to spread the news, but Penelope found that she did not care. Let them talk. Let them whisper. Let the whole world know that Penelope Ashworth, the disowned daughter, the invisible librarian, had finally been seen. The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small chapel on the Thornwell estate. It was a quiet affair, by Christopher's design, not Penelope's. "I would invite the entire county," he told her the night before, "but I want you two myself. Is that selfish?" "Utterly," she said, smiling. "I would not have it any other way." Only a handful of guests attended. The vicar, the steward, a few servants who had known Penelope as a child and remembered her with more fondness than Mrs. Harlow had anticipated. The housekeeper herself had resigned in a huff, but Christopher had replaced her with a cheerful young woman from the village, who thought the whole affair was terribly romantic. Penelope wore a dress of pale blue, not white, because she was not a bride who believed in innocence, but blue because Christopher had once said it matched her eyes. She had let her hair down, and it fell in soft waves around her shoulders, streaked now with the first hints of silver. She did not wear spectacles. She did not need them to see the man waiting for her at the altar. Christopher looked at her as she walked down the aisle, and his eyes shone with a tenderness that made her heart ache. He took her hands in his, and they spoke their vows in voices that trembled only a little. "I, Christopher, take you, Penelope, not as my servant, not as my secret, but as my equal, my partner, my home. I, Penelope, take you, Christopher, not as my saviour, not as my escape, but as the man who saw me when I was invisible and loved me anyway." The vicar pronounced them man and wife, and when Christopher kissed her, there in the candle-lit chapel, Penelope felt the last cold shard of her old life melt away. That evening, they sat together in the library. Their library now, though the sign on the door still said Thornwell House Private Collection. Penelope had a volume of Donne open in her lap, and Christopher had his arm around her shoulders, his chin resting on her hair. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The scandal, the gossip, marrying a woman with no name and no fortune and a past full of holes." He was silent for a moment. Then he reached over and turned the page of her book to the poem he had read to her that first night in his study. "She's all states, and all princes I," he quoted softly. "Nothing else is." Penelope smiled and leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows, and the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the world in white. Inside the library, surrounded by books and warmth and the quiet miracle of being loved, Penelope Ward, Penelope Ashworth, Penelope Dane, closed her eyes and made a wish. She wished for nothing, because she already had everything. The end. Thank you, dear reader of the Regency Gazette, for joining us in another tale of love, intrigue, and whispered ballroom secrets. If today's romance delighted you, kindly bestow a like upon this video. It helps our Gazette reach more lovers of Regency storytelling. For weekly journeys into dukes, debutantes, scandals, and slow-burning devotion, please subscribe to the Gazette